Theodore Robert Bundy.
Ted Bundy.
Theodore Bundy.
Ted Bundy. Even decades after his execution, his name still carries a kind of cultural electricity. Books, movies, documentaries, and courtroom footage replayed endlessly. A face that, depending on who you ask, was either boyishly handsome or chillingly blank. And as always, the same claim follows: that he was charming, that he was brilliant, that he was a master manipulator, that he could talk his way into and out of anything. And perhaps the most enduring myth of all, that Ted Bundy was his own best lawyer. I'm Esther, host of Once Upon a Crime. Thank you for joining me for our new series, which I've titled Ted Bundy for the Defense. In this series, you'll hear about Ted Bundy's fatal flaw, that he insisted on defending himself, a decision that would lead him to the electric chair. In courtrooms across Utah, Colorado, and Florida, Ted Bundy rejected experienced attorneys. He cross-examined police officers. He argued motions. He questioned witnesses. He addressed juries who would ultimately decide whether he lived or died. And for years, that spectacle has been framed as proof of his genius. But what if it wasn't genius at all? What if Ted Bundy didn't outsmart the system? What if he exposed himself as a monster? Before we get into it, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next part. This story unfolds across multiple episodes, and the next part drops soon, and it changes everything you may have thought you knew about Ted Bundy. In our last series, we dismantled the myth of the Black Dahlia, how legend, repetition, and rumor distorted the truth, until the real woman at the center of the crime, Elizabeth Short, was almost lost. This series does something similar, because the Ted Bundy myth has become ubiquitous. In the public's consciousness, Bundy has become not just a serial killer, but a character. The smart serial killer, the charming serial killer, the one who could blend in, the one who fooled everyone, and most dangerously, the one who nearly got away with it all. But when you strip away the myth-making, what's left is something far less impressive and far more revealing. We want to thank Completing the Puzzle for sponsoring today's episode. For puzzles made easy, go to completingthepuzzle.com. It's basically Netflix for puzzles. Rent, solve, return, repeat. Use our coupon code OUAC for $10 off your first subscription box or gift card. Completing the Puzzle, because no one's been murdered while doing a puzzle. Let's start with the word everyone uses: charismatic. It appears in nearly every description of Ted Bundy, often without question, often without evidence. We're told he was magnetic, that women trusted him instantly, that he disarmed people with a smile, preppy appearance, and polite conversation. But here's the problem. Charm can't be faked. It comes from within. It's like a light that emanates from your energy. Fake charm, phony charisma, won't fool people for long. They'll see through it like headlights through fog. And Ted Bundy wasn't charming or convincing to everyone. Survivors didn't describe him as charming. They described him as awkward, insistent, and off-putting. Someone who lingered a little too long. Someone who didn't quite understand normal human boundaries. That was his tell. What Bundy had wasn't charm. It was persistence, paired with social norms that conditioned people, especially women, to be polite even when they were uncomfortable. So some ignored the red flags, or didn't have enough time to register them in time to run. Bundy exploited expectations, those things all of us who don't live in darkness have. The expectation of safety, the expectation of human kindness and decency. And when charm failed, he relied on something else entirely: force. That really doesn't fit into the Bundy mythology, so it's often ignored. Now let's talk about the version of Ted Bundy that truly fascinates people. Ted Bundy the lawyer, or more accurately, Ted Bundy playing a lawyer. The myth tells us he was a brilliant, self-taught legal mind, that he understood courtroom strategy better than trained professionals, that judges respected him, that prosecutors feared him. But the reality is much simpler. Ted Bundy was not a lawyer. He never passed the bar. He never even completed law school. What he was articulate, confident, and profoundly narcissistic. Those traits can look like intelligence, especially on camera. The public observed Bundy exuding confidence in short clips on nightly newsreels. They saw him in a suit and tie carrying legal files, as shown in newspaper photos. They didn't experience him in real life. Bundy understood legal language at a surface level. He could mimic the cadence of attorneys. He knew enough to sound convincing to people who didn't know better. But sounding smart and being effective are two very different things. When Ted Bundy represented himself, the courtroom became his stage. He objected frequently, often incorrectly. He rambled. He grandstanded. He treated witnesses like props. And the press loved it. It sold papers. So did his admirers. Young women showed up to watch him. They wrote him letters. They smiled when he spoke. Bundy noticed, and he leaned into it. This wasn't about legal strategy. This was about control. And Bundy's crimes, as we know, were all about control. This was about being seen, about being heard, about proving, at least to himself, that he was special. But courtrooms are not theaters, and juries are not audiences. Some of the most disturbing moments in Ted Bundy's trials weren't about the evidence. They were about choice. During cross-examination, Bundy questioned law enforcement officers about crime scenes, not in a way that clarified facts, but in a way that forced them to describe in detail what they had found. Bodies, trauma, violence. He asked questions that made jurors physically recoil, not because the information was necessary for the case, but because he wanted to hear it, and because he wanted them to hear it. Jurors later described being horrified, not just by the crimes, but by Bundy himself, by the detachment, by the lack of humanity, by the way he spoke about victims as objects. These moments weren't clever. They were catastrophic. He was reliving his crimes in horrifying detail, in front of the whole world, and more importantly, in front of the jury that would ultimately decide his fate. Bundy's self-representation also came with privileges, access to law libraries, and more freedom of movement, and more contact with staff, and he exploited every inch of it. His escapes from custody are often framed as evidence of his brilliance, his strategic mind that outsmarted law enforcement. But again, that's a myth. The escapes worked because the system assumed good faith, because it underestimated how far Bundy would go, and because he was willing to manipulate anything, including the legal process, to serve himself. Even law enforcement agencies would later acknowledge that Bundy's legal maneuvers weren't principled. They were opportunistic. Hey everyone, before we get back to the episode, I want to introduce you to our newest sponsor, Completing the Puzzle, the subscription puzzle service that is officially my favorite new way to spend a cozy night in. So here's the deal. Every month, they send you a beautiful, high-quality jigsaw puzzle. You put the pieces together, literally, and when you're done, you send it back for free, and they swap it out for a brand new one. No clutter, no storage crisis, no suspicious pile of puzzles lurking in the corner like evidence you haven't disposed of yet. And because this is Once Upon a Crime, let me just say this. If you've ever wanted to practice your detective skills without getting, arrested, this is the perfect hobby. You get all the satisfaction of solving something without any fingerprints left at the scene. And for our viewers, we've got a special deal. Use the code OUAC at checkout for $10 off a subscription or gift card. That's 33% off your first month. So head on over to completingthepuzzle.com, use code OUAC, and start solving your monthly mystery today. Completing the Puzzle. because no one's been murdered doing a puzzle. Ted Bundy didn't doom himself because he lacked intelligence. He doomed himself because he lacked self-awareness. He thought juries would see what he saw and believe what he believed about himself. He thought that judges would admire him, that people would recognize his superiority. He couldn't even fathom how he appeared to others, cold, arrogant, and cruel. When plea deals were offered, deals that could have spared his life, Bundy rejected them, not because he was innocent, but because accepting them required admitting weakness. And Ted Bundy, the sociopath, could not do that. Over the course of this series, we'll examine how Bundy's courtroom behavior actively damaged his defense, how real attorneys tried and failed to rein him in, how judges tolerated his antics longer than they should have, how jurors interpreted his performance very differently than the public, and how the myth of Ted Bundy continues to obscure the reality of who he was. We'll detail the most bizarre and disturbing moments of the trial and learn about how Bundy's pathological need for control affected the survivors and the victims' loved ones. Our legal system allows the accused to defend themselves. Bundy exploited this to continue to inflict pain and trauma on the victims. This isn't a story about a brilliant criminal mastermind. It's a story about a man who mistook attention for intelligence, performance for competence, and control for power. And in doing so, sealed his own fate. Ted Bundy wanted to be remembered as extraordinary. The series isn't about giving him that. It's about showing what happens when myth collides with reality, in a courtroom, under oath, with lives on the line. This is Ted Bundy for the defense, and the trial has only just begun. Ted Bundy thought that juries would see him the way he saw himself, the most intelligent person in the room, and someone who was in command of the legal system. In this series, we're going to test that belief, step by step, courtroom by courtroom. In part 1, we'll rewind to the early 1970s and trace Bundy's crimes as they first began to surface, leading to his 1976 trial in Utah for the attempted kidnapping of Carol Durant. It was here, for the first time, that Bundy insisted on defending himself, and where a jury would deliver a verdict he never believed was possible. In part 2, the net tightens, as investigators in the Pacific Northwest quietly connected a growing number of murders to a man named Ted. Bundy was arrested again, this time for the murder of Karen Campbell in Colorado. Confident and increasingly reckless, he prepared once more to act as his own attorney. With access to a law library and a belief in his own superiority, Bundy would take a gamble that allowed him to vanish and set the stage for something far worse. And in part 3, we follow Bundy to Florida, to the Chi Omega sorority house and the brutal attacks that shocked the nation. We'll examine the subsequent murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, Bundy's final arrests, and the capital trials where his arrogance, grandstanding, and his need for control ultimately sealed his fate. This is not the story of a criminal mastermind undone by bad luck. It's the story of a man who believed he could outthink the law and chose to stand alone in court while doing it. Join me for Ted Bundy for the defense, because sometimes the most damaging witness is the defendant himself. Before you go, if this episode made you rethink what you thought you knew about Ted Bundy, you're going to want to stay with us for the rest of this series. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter of Ted Bundy for the Defense, where we dig deeper into the trials, the courtroom theatrics, and the choices that ultimately sealed Bundy's fate. If you found this episode valuable, please give it a like. It really helps the channel. And share it with someone who's interested in true crime that goes beyond the headlines. Have thoughts or questions about Bundy representing himself? Drop them in the comments. We value your comments and questions. And if you want more long-form true crime storytelling, you'll find the links in the description to the full podcast and past episodes. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Once again, we'd like to thank Completing the Puzzle for sponsoring this video. Completing the Puzzle is the first ever puzzle rental subscription service delivered right to your door. Join over 60,000 happy puzzlers at completingthepuzzle.com and use our discount code OUAC for $10 off your first subscription box or gift card. Completing the Puzzle, because no one's been murdered while doing a puzzle.